Friends, Romans, liverymen, lend me your ears. I have come... I'm just joking. I give you Andrew Hildreth, Dr. Andrew Hildreth, an horological intellectual and liveryman of the Worshipful Company of Clockmakers, and fellow of the Royal Statistical Society. He gained his PhD in economics and statistics, University of Cambridge, is a fellow at Oxford University, professor at Berkeley, California, writer of all things horological, and a collector of watches. So he can probably tell us how to travel back and forth in time by now.
I wish I knew.
Peter Speakmarin. I'll allow him to introduce himself since I've already done so, and let's see if you can do me one better.
This is the 2-minute live explanation.
Well.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Okay. I went to college with him over there, and I think we were behind you by 1 year.
1 year behind me.
That was like a long time ago. That was back in 1985. 85? Yeah, whatever. Okay, so back then. So my story was I went from Hackney College to Wostep in Neuchâtel, the school. Then I worked in Oxford for Rolex and various other companies before going to be the Piaget watchmaker in London, and then working for Omega in Southampton before jumping back to see that guy. Jump Mr. Bit. 6 years in Somnum Antiques here in Piccadilly, where I met that young man over there when he was 16 years old. And there I spent just over 6 years restoring antique watches. Then I met Stephen again, working for Renaud and Papy in Le Locle in Switzerland, Neuchâtel. Following the 4 years that I spent there, I then developed a small company where I worked as a watchmaker, building complications, then project management, designing, and then in 2008 I committed all my time to developing my own company, which was my family name, is my family name, which I did until 2016, 2017. And then in early part of 2017, I dropped or left, departed from my brand to develop an educational platform called The Naked Watchmaker, which kind of brings us up to date, with the exception to a small project that I have, which is associated with Stoicism, the philosophy, which I am very interested in, shall we say. And that is something which is running parallel to the Naked Watchmaker. And the goal of both projects, in a sense, is the sharing of knowledge when it comes to the Naked Watchmaker and the intellectual wisdom which is associated with Stoicism. So that's probably more than 2 minutes, but I'll shut up and leave to the next person.
Let me introduce. With a resume as intricate as the Potsdam Agreement, Dr. Rebecca Struthers started her educational journey as an infant, upon surveying her tender age. She is a watchmaker and historian, co-founder of the Struthers Watchmaking Workshops, and the first watchmaker in British history to earn a PhD in horology. In this case, putting a face to the name would be recognizing Charles Frodsham & Co. when you see Richard Stenning. A fellow liveryman and council member of the Antiquarian Horological Society, Richard holds on to history and oversees its gentle thrust into the future, ensuring eternal ripples for the timeless. Roger Smith, a protege from age 16, as a winner of the British Horological Institute's Bronze Medal, he has had the rare privilege of learning from the hand of George Daniels and creating alongside him the Millennium Series. Roger is a watchmaster that breaks strides by hand as opposed to letting technology take the credit from him. A Brit in disguise, Stephen Forcey started his horological journey in England, then went straight to the Lion's Den, Switzerland, to further his education at Wostep. Since then, the world has seen complications and movements they couldn't even contemplate the existence of through Completime and Grubel Forcey. Thank you.
All right, well, welcome, and thank you to one and all on the panel here. I'm going to start off with a very general question to all of you. Perhaps the exception of Rebecca here, the rest of us are of a certain vintage where you have to wonder why you got into watchmaking in the first place. I mean, given Peter's already said that he graduated in 1985, that wasn't exactly what I would call a boom industry at the time. So I'll start with Stephen, we'll work our way along. So why watchmaking, Stephen?
Well, thank you, Andrew, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for all being here. And for myself, well, actually, as a child, I was fascinated by anything mechanical. So my grandfather was an automotive engineer, an aviation engineer. My father was an industrial chemist, and my mother an art teacher. So I actually found this sort of three essential ingredients of watchmaking: art, mechanics, and science. And I had this crazy idea when I was about 11, 12 years old to restore or to make clocks. And fortunately for me, and unfortunately for you guys, because now I'm here talking about it, but fortunately my parents supported me against my grandfather's idea that I should be an engineer. But in the school I was in St Albans, Hertfordshire, just about 22 miles from here, they didn't even know what horology was. So it was kind of a struggle, but we found out there was still the school in Hackney. I went there. And, it was a revolution. It was, for me, I'd really found a passion. And thanks to meeting also some of the greats, George Daniels gave a talk to us quite early on. That was inspirational. And, then the rest is sort of history, really.
You moved with the times.
Well, each pathway, I think you come to a crossroads and there are different choices. And if you're fortunate, you can move forwards each time, and you try and do the best you can. So I've been very lucky to be able to explore and continue that passion and build a team, build a small adventure with Robert Grobel, who I met in '92. He actually gave me a job. And the anecdote there, I suppose, is he couldn't speak English and I couldn't speak French, really. So, but as watchmakers, we made a deal, and I thought I wouldn't stay in Switzerland, actually. So, I thought, see how the Swiss make watches, how hard can it be? A year or two would be enough. But each time there was a new challenge, and through 7 years, a very, very exciting time through the 90s, which coincided with this renaissance of mechanical watches and the interest in them that I think all and together we believe in passionately, and we would also all like to try and grow that in terms of awareness, interest, and try and safeguard some of these endangered traditional skills.
Thank you. And Roger, I know that George played a role in your epiphany, I suppose.
Yeah, very much so. Similar-ish story to Stephen's. And I enrolled on a course at the age of 16 in Manchester, where I was training to be a watch repairer or a clock repairer. I didn't know what. And again, we had a visit by George Daniels, and it was that moment and that evening when he delivered a lecture talking about his view on watchmaking that really sort of opened my eyes to another world. As Stephen mentioned, I mean, watchmaking in those days, clock repairing even, you really were the lowest of the low.
I mean, it wasn't exactly a boom time, was it?
No, it is potentially a very bleak future ahead. And here was this man who was making his own path, his own history, and that impressed me. And eventually, on leaving the college course at the age of 19, I went to work for a trade repairers, which was interesting experience, but it was really that moment that I sort of realised I had to do something. And remembering George's, the meeting with George and reading his book, and I thought, well, I've got to do something. And I wrote to George, asked him if he'd apprentice me.
And he sent you away, I believe.
He sent me away and told me to make a watch. So that was a good, interesting start to my career.
Yeah. Richard.
Good afternoon, everybody. I stumbled into horology. I didn't find it. I was in a horological museum in East Anglia and was in a room full of fabulous clocks, and the light shone through the window, and I had an epiphany moment. I went, this is it, this is it. These are all the things I love. These are the things that I, at school, was good at. These are the things that I would like to continue to do. So there was creativity, there was maths, there was physics, there was art, there was history. All these things blended together in horology. And from that, I then discovered, like these guys, that you could actually study it, because at the time, nobody ever told you those sort of things. Went off to Hackney, and after that did an apprenticeship with a renowned clockmaker in Clerkenwell. Clerkenwell was still just the sort of seat of London horological learning. I used to do feathering of hummingbirds and things like that on singing bird boxes, very obscure things. Then I worked for, dare I say it in this establishment, the other one, Sotheby's, as their watch and clock cataloguer, put sales together in London and New York and Geneva. Met a lot of interesting people, saw some fabulous, fabulous pieces. And then after that, I joined my now co-director of Frodshams, and the rest, as Stephen says, is history.
And you bought out the name eventually and set up.
Indeed, yes, in the mid-90s, and then have slowly built the brand back up to its former glory.
Which is excellent to see. Now, Rebecca, I'm guessing that you didn't graduate somewhere around 1985. You graduated sometime after that. So was horology looking like a better picture for you? Was that why you went into it? Or was it just still that same base fascination that I didn't care about the state of the market and I don't care about what it looks like out there, I'll just do it?
Yeah, I think, to be honest, it was an accident. It was a bit of an accident, and I was a high school dropout, I suppose. I really struggled at school. So I loved art and I loved science, but in the UK we're taught them as completely different subjects and with no overlap. And I took really art-led GCSEs, sorry guys, it was those days, and converted over to sciences for my A-levels. So I went to a grammar and it was very much, you're a doctor, a lawyer, or a failure, and that's it. There are no successful careers in the arts, so forget it. So I pursued sciences and I just got so bored and lost, really, and I decided to leave halfway through my A-levels and run away to art school, which at the time was pretty much on a par with running away to join the circus. It was kind of similar levels of success.
Less lucrative, though.
Yeah. I actually had teachers when I got my results saying, but Rebecca, you're doing quite well. Are you sure you're doing the right thing here? And I was like, yes, I'm sure. So I ran off to what was the Birmingham Institute of Art and Design. I started there in 2003, studying jewellery and silversmithing. So I'm local to the jewellery quarter in Birmingham, and I like the idea of doing something with my hands again. Worked for 2 years alongside an Austrian mastering goldsmith, Peter Sazarczyk, and whilst I was there, started developing an interest in making basic sort of articulated pieces, some very, very basic automata, and it just so happened that there was a horology course being taught at the same college. So I had the watchmaking students spot some of my work in an exhibition and say, oh, Rebecca, you should come and check out the watchmaking workshop. I think you'd like it. And I was thinking, yeah, like, I like making, but I miss kind of the structure and some rigidity in what I'm doing. So I went along and that was it. I thought, this is it. Again, it seems to be a common thread going between all of us. It's that combination of art, science, so you get to be an engineer, a designer, a historian, all in one go. And I think it's a subject that challenges me every day, and I love it. Yeah, and the rest is history.
We're back on history. So, Peter, I mean, you've had a varied horological career, from founding your own brand to now education and putting that out on the internet. So what sort of quintessentially drew you to watchmaking? Was it the same notions as Stephen?
Really. At the very beginning, it was because I wanted to travel. And I went to Hackney College as almost a last resort. I didn't even know what horology was when I was 17 years old, when a careers teacher led me there. And one of the key elements which actually drew me to it was the concept that if you became a watchmaker, you'd be able to work anywhere. A watchmaker, watch technician, wherever you wanted to be in the world, you could actually work. And that was really the real reason why, as well as having no true direction when I was 17, of why I started at Hackney College. But then, and then I had these commercial jobs, and then I worked for Somno Antiques, which is 5 minutes up the road from here. And all of the jobs that I'd had prior to that moment lasted about 6 months. The moment that I'd kind of like learnt everything, I got bored, and then I moved on. And then at Somno Antiques, I was there for just under 7 years. And whilst I was there, I fell madly, crazily in love with this profession by seeing how different brands developed over 100 or 150 years. I restored watches which were from brands which are completely forgotten today. Pieces which go back to the 17th century, right up until about the 1950s. And I had no history of, unbeknown to me, eventually I found out a few years ago that there was watchmaking in my family. But at the time, this was just a magical world. And I fell completely in love with this whole horological entity. And for me, for Stephen, it was, I think he said, art, mechanics, and science. For me, it was more the idea of art, mechanics, and history. And they were the things which I kind of was better at school and I enjoyed. And that's what watchmaking is for me. That's what I love about it. So it began in the antique restoration world, and then it just carried on.
Right. So this is going to be a very broad question, and I'll sort of start picking and choosing victims as we go. But start to think about the topic of this particular forum, which is English watchmaking generally, with a fancier title. How do you think being labelled as an English watchmaker, do you think that's an advantage, a disadvantage? Do you think the definition exists? Why do you think it exists? And I think I'm going to have to go with Roger on this one first, given your film appearances.
For me, it's a positive. That's very definite break between Swiss watchmaking and British watchmaking, English watchmaking, for me is a huge plus. And that's obviously enhanced by the place that I work in, the Isle of Man. You know, it's
which will count as England for
yes,
today.
British,
okay.
yes. So yeah, no, it can only be positive. You've got an immediate differentiation, and obviously being separate from the watch industry, there's zero influence in what I'm trying to create, and yeah, it's a clear story, and it means I can do anything.
Okay, so the converse case of that, I'm going to put the question to Peter, who's an English watchmaker by nominal definition, English and a watchmaker. But do you feel there's an English watchmaking as a term? Do you think that's an advantage, a disadvantage?
Well, talking from a sort of a past life, when I had my brand in Switzerland, it was both. It was an advantage and a disadvantage. An advantage because it's something which differentiates you, because there aren't that many English watchmakers. And the sort of the USP behind it was something which people are always fond of. But at the same time, everything that I did was in Switzerland. So it was not, as Roger makes, it was not an English watch. And when you develop a brand, clarity, simplicity to deliver a message is important. So it did cause a certain amount of confusion. And even like 10 years into the whole process, people would still say, so whereabouts in England are you making the watches? So it's an advantage, but it's also slightly confusing from where I came from my personal experience.
And just to put Rebecca into the story, since you graduated sort of after the rest of the class of 85 here, approximately, give or take, do you feel English watchmaking is an advantage, or English watchmaker, sorry, is an advantage, disadvantage? Do you think there is a term there, or?
I don't know. I suppose I've never really viewed myself as being an English watchmaker, aside from the fact I am English and I am a watchmaker. There's no denying that. But the way I kind of work and design and make, I view myself within a much greater picture and history of watchmaking. So we're working on our first in-house movement at the moment, and there's an engraver whose work I absolutely love. He's brilliant, and just so happens to work with a company down the road from us in Birmingham, but he's based in Austria. He's Austrian. And I'm going to work with him. I don't care that it won't be an entirely British thing because our engraver's Austrian. I want to work with the best people in the world, no matter where they are, no matter who they are. I want to work with the very, very best to make what I do. So I've never kind of felt that back of the whole, I've got to be super English. But then there is also, I feel, quite a bit of pressure at the moment on what defines a British brand. And I don't know whether that pressure comes from watchmakers themselves or our clients or the press. But there is obviously a lot of hotly debated conversation about what really defines British watchmaking. I just try and keep out of it.
Just to press forward on that, not necessarily just to yourself, but do you believe there's a set of style elements then that defines the English watch? I could be sort of pushing some buttons here and say, well, I can see that Daniel's borrowed heavily from, say, Breguet's design style. And so therefore, is there an English watch style that we would... Roger, you'll get to answer this in a second. Do you think there's an English watch style that should be defined?
We've all everything borrows from something somewhere along the line. There used to be a very traditional English watch style. If you go back 200 years, you could quite quickly tell the difference between a British watch, a French watch, a Swiss or German watch. Now, I think the lines are far more blurred. I mean, you can always go for that kind of really traditional, back to basics, acanthus, just beautifully finished, but not necessarily the most grand of complications, but that real beautiful traditional finishing, I think is perhaps slightly more of an English thing, but I think it's very, very blurred now. And I think that's a cool thing. Well, we didn't really make wristwatches, did we, traditionally in Britain? So we've already borrowed that from the Swiss.
Well, Roger, I've got to give you the chance to sort of answer that one.
Sorry.
Do you think there's an English watchmaking style? My argument was that Daniels did borrow heavily from Breguet and
I think
historically.
I think we've all put our own stamp on, where we believe English British watchmaking, what it should look like. George Daniels. Did he borrow from Breguet? I think he improved on Breguet, but that's my impression. Right. He developed his very own particular style, and you can spot a Daniels a mile off. And my watch, it took many years to try and have the confidence and experience to develop my own style. I think people would describe it as a very English style. As Rebecca said, there was no real watch industry. The Smith watch industries who were making a very different watch, a mass-produced watch, but it's down to the watchmaker, I think. Yeah.
All right. So Richard, given that you are equally now at the helm of an English watchmaking company once again that's producing watches in England, do you think there's an English watchmaking style? I mean, why didn't you sort of move the workshop out to Switzerland?
I agree with Rebecca. If you look back historically, you can define an English watch. And I think that has carried through to all of our work. I think that simplicity is there, understatedness is there. Mm-hmm. I think the Brits were always good at high quality finishing as well. And I think we all do that too. So I think those three elements are the DNA that has been dragged through 200 years to the modern day watchmaking.
So, pushing on from that, so do you think the English watch industry will ever lead the world again? And again, maybe it never did, but we might have coloured most of the globe red, given it the Meridian line. But will we ever become the world supplier of watches, such as the Swiss? And I think we've got to go to one of the two gentlemen who actually ply their trade in Switzerland. So I'll ask Stephen this one first out.
Well, when I went to Switzerland, I'd worked for 5 years in just up the road in Bond Street for Asprey with Mr. John Asprey, still the family then. And they were hugely passionate about watchmaking. They'd built some fantastic collections for people. But it was the summit. At that time, we tried in the workshop because they had a certain number of times they wanted 10 watches like this or 10 like that. And we tried to get an initiative to actually make the cases in England. There was still a company called Wilmot in Birmingham. But it didn't take hold. You know, it was too early. And yet I wanted to move on. So for me, it was logical to go to Switzerland to see, you know, I had this opportunity to go and work at Renault Papy, which was a sort of incubator. It was very, very early on, trying to make complicated mechanical wristwatches. When I started there in September '92, so 26 years ago, they delivered the first 6 movements. It'd taken them nearly, probably 3 years to get that far. So it was a very early time then. But, and it was kind of curious because I arrived there with, you know, really less than skeletal French. And I was in a workshop. There were 2 or 3 of the 6 graduates from the La Chaux-de-Fonds School of Watchmaking that year. So you have to put it in that context. It was a wasteland, and that's how I got a job there. But I wasn't really accepted.
You yourself a disservice there, Steve.
Well, no, but in a way, no, because you needed a work permit to get there. So to get a work permit, you had to have, the company had to demonstrate to the authorities that nobody locally could do what I could do. And because I'd been restoring antique watches, a little bit like Peter, a huge variety of things, I managed to get a work permit. And yet I had to prove, you know, that I knew something. And fortunately, I'd restored repeaters and, you know, different mechanisms and complications, so I could demonstrate that I knew a couple of things. And so after that, yeah, it was, you know, it's kind of a novelty. Le Locle is it's like a million miles away from.
But your knowledge has stayed in Switzerland in terms of you didn't then sort of come back here and open up.
Well, it just
a
didn't happen,
production,
you know. No,
you stayed with the sort of the more complicated watches that provide a great deal of interest.
Well,
Require
I
a
think
great deal of thought.
it was the feeling that, you know, that there was, you know, by the late 90s with Robert Rebel, we'd been working on a number of projects, and it was more or less a chance occasion, and we thought, well, you know, there's a millennium round the corner. Today it's history, it sounds cliched, but it was there, and we're thinking, you know, sort of, what could we be doing as watchmakers in 5-10 years' time? And when we looked around, there were many beautiful watches, but they were actually still made in a sort of traditional mindset in Switzerland. So that means that you would take an idea and then you would industrialize it and try and make a bigger volume and then make it more accessible, etc. But that level of finish, which quite rightly our other panelists here all love and practice, you know, that level of finish, that English finish, is something quite particular. So with Robert, we actually had a blank sheet of paper. It really was, because we could have found an old Swiss name and revived that and based on their DNA. But we felt that we had a story to tell, and we wanted to express something differently and carve our own path. So, entente cordiale, Frenchman and an Englishman in Switzerland. So creating a very unique sort of assemblage, you know. And
It goes back to Breguet and Arnold, I suppose. And,
well, you know, yeah, it's been a lot
go.
of exchange. You know, historically, Switzerland made raw movements in Le Locle with Breguet when he exiled there during the Revolution, when they wanted to shorten him from the top end. You know,
Dr. Guillotine.
Mademoiselle Guillotine. Yeah. So you know, he went to Le Locle, and they actually had there with Hourier, with some other really great craftsmen. They actually started and developed more these this approach of raw movements, ébauche, and then in the late 19th century, in fact, quite a few of the English watches were made in the Vallée de Joux, either as raw movements in an English style rather than the Swiss style, and brought over. And then you also found that going across to Germany, to Glashütte, where you see also. So it's, you know, it's, but there is an English style in there, and I think we've tried to bring some of what we, you know, because we had this blank sheet of paper, we could really take elements that we thought were interesting and pertinent to be able to create something different.
So I'll be sort of horribly condescending here, but so if I wanted to pick up that argument, you could sort of take an argument that the Swiss contribution to horology was the invention of mass production. They were able to use the burghers in the valleys and bring back the pieces to Geneva, assemble these base movements, and then ship them out. So is it the fact that English watchmaking failed to capitalize on its ideas?
Well, it's interesting because the geography of Switzerland with the valleys, I mean, I went there 26 years ago, Le Locle, La Chaux-de-Fonds, 900 and 1,000 meters above sea level. La Chaux-de-Fonds has virtually no natural springs, but it's a town which was at the peak probably 50,000 people in watchmaking. And yet it's behind a mountain which is another 300 meters higher, and the tunnel was actually, the road tunnel was actually pierced in 1994. So for that, until then, it was a sort of a, you know, it was quite a closed community. In the winter, snow, people stayed in these regions, and I think Switzerland managed to sustain and preserve what in England perished because of that particular geography, that the valleys specialized in different techniques and different skills, and they were fairly close-knit communities. They didn't diffuse. Whereas in the UK, you had in London the English watchmaking centre, but then you had Coventry, you had a watch company, you had in Prescott, in Lancashire. So you already had a certain diffusion of it, and then because of the way that these things develop, also you know, political decisions, I guess, along the way.
I'll come back to that.
Yeah, which meant that it diffused, and watchmaking became less of an interest in the UK, perhaps, in that side.
I'll come back to the political side and the interest side, but Richard, do you think that we failed to capitalize? We, as in the royal we, the English watchmakers, blah, 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 failed to capitalize on these ideas, that we didn't push for mass production. We were always happy in our innovative little potting shed. And
we are very much innovators in the potting shed, most definitely. Give an Englishman a piece of paper and ask him to design or construct something. They'll come up with a solution, and then they'll put it to one side and take on the next one. So yes, it wasn't just the Swiss. Of course, the Americans in the latter part of the 19th century took on mass production in a big way.
But was it just the English? I mean, Breguet was never too happy with the fact that he had to actually mass produce at one point with a partner, and promptly tried to end that arrangement and go back to his complications.
Yeah.
So.
Historically, English watchmakers found their own little niches with their clients. So you look at all the famous makers, English makers back in the day, the Tompions and the Mudges and the Arnolds and the Earnshaws. They all had a niche market, and they fulfilled it. Tompion, for instance, is best known for his clocks, but his bread and butter was most definitely his watches. They were easier to construct, easy to sell, and he sold an awful lot of them. So, yes, we're good, I think, at filling the gaps, but not going any further. Yeah.
So you could describe us almost as our own worst enemy, that we might be very good at sorting out technical problems, but not so good at putting production numbers together. You touched on some of the leading lights of English horology, so Harrison, Tompion, Graham, Arnold, Mudge. You're saying that they mass-produced or didn't mass-produce, and therefore were they the world supplier? Or?
Well, yes, in context, yes, they were mass-producing.
They were mass-producing.
They produced as much as they could possibly sell. So from that point of view, yes, I would consider that they were. By today's figures, these are really small numbers that were being made by those makers.
So, but Harrison really was only just solving a problem.
He was, yes, yeah, he definitely was not. Yeah,
No, he was not in the mass production.
not
yeah.
in the mass production area, but he was solving the problems, which allowed others to then take on and develop those ideas. So,
Yeah.
Harrison's work was a lifetime of research.
Yes. I mean, he spent 19 years, what, on one clock?
Yep.
Between H3 and H4, or was it just for H3? I can't, it was for
Well,
H3.
H1 was almost finished, and he put it to one side because he realised there were some elements which were technically probably not going to deliver the goods, and moved on to H2, and yeah. But I don't think he ever sold anything commercially, really, except to the
one or
except
two
for the price
early
for
turret clocks for
Oh yeah, that's true.
prior to the
Yeah.
marine timekeepers, but apart from that, no.
So in terms of English watchmaking, we had the finishing, the particular look at technical problems. So you could argue that we've got a preoccupation with accuracy, the escapement, and that we leave perhaps other complications to other watchmakers from other countries, that we're more concerned with exactly how accurate the watch will be. Historically, do you believe that's correct? And I'll go to Rebecca because she's a historian in all of this. So
Yeah.
how far is this preoccupation with accuracy the English problem?
Yeah, I don't think I've ever seen it as a preoccupation with accuracy. It's a very different, perhaps, set of motivations behind doing what we do. For me, making a watch isn't even about accuracy. Obviously, you know, it's going to tell the time, but I like to make things. I like to be hands-on with what I'm doing. I like to be able to put some of myself in everything that I do. And for me, there is just no appeal to mass manufacture at all. And I don't know if that stands for anyone else on this panel too. It's not about if I had a load of investment, I could just send all my designs out to somewhere else and have the cases made and the dials made and the movements made somewhere. But I would derive no passion and love from that. And I don't know if that's something perhaps with British watchmakers as well, because we have had the ability to access and change. You do see some kind of acceptance in the 1880s. We actually went over, the likes of Rotherham's and companies in the UK went to the US to buy in the machinery required to start making movements completely by machine in England. But of course it was far too late. By the 1880s, the Swiss were already doing it and we were behind. So kind of we do try later, I think, in attempts to save what's left of the industry. But I do feel like that maybe that is part of the British passion, is we're quite hands-on, I think, as watchmakers go. I don't know. Do you guys, what do you think?
Peter, do you think that's...
You're the historian, you know the facts at the end of the day. My perception, one of your first questions was, did we in England rule as far as the production of watches or horology as a whole? And you're going to correct me, but from what I understood at one point, one of the biggest industries in London was in Clerkenwell, and it was building marine chronometers. Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, yeah, mass production is a thing of perspective, isn't it?
It's all perspective, because the world is not, the world has changed in the last 20 years, last 10 years. So we're talking about 150, 200 years ago. So you can't make a direct comparison with what is, with what was and what is. But at that point in time, when it came to precision, when it came to chronometry, motivation through the Admiralty, through the Navy, through the empire of the time, we did, in a sense, lead the world. And then you have, whether it's wars or politics or change in mentality, everything slowly changed. I used to restore early English watches by Frogem, by Dent, made by some of them then made by Nicol-Nielsen in Switzerland. But the early English pieces were fabulous. The escapements were incredible. And some of these pieces that I restored, which were made in the UK, to my knowledge, the repeaters and the complications, I believe, were made in Switzerland, the basic embouchures, but the simple pieces were made in the UK, had escapements, the likes of which were never made in Switzerland, which were absolutely incredible. And I don't know whether it was the politics, which you alluded to, which I'm curious about, or whether it was that the cost of making pieces as they did back then was just more expensive, even though it was in quality, if you like, better, than what was being made in Switzerland. Is it a stubbornness of an industry at that period, which actually prevented them from continuing? Was it the commercialization from Switzerland to do things in larger numbers? I don't know personally. I'm very curious, and I think
I'm going to pick up on two of the elements you mentioned there. One of which was, we'll come back to the politics one, but the other one was stubbornness in terms of English watchmaking, sort of not to change, not to adapt. I mean, we didn't even make the quartz crisis along with the rest of the watchmaking world. You know, the English watchmaking industry is pretty much done and dusted before the quartz crisis even hit. So what part do you think institutions play in making, in providing an inhospitable arrangement? So we can think of, or I can think of, possible reasons. For instance, let's go back to Clerkenwell, let's go back to Hatton Cross. And Rolex was an English watchmaking company to begin with. Wilsdorf decided to up and leave after the First World War. There were taxes on that were levied on luxury imports, and he found the situation unpalatable and uneconomic. So how far are institutions such as government or institutions within the UK that concentrate on craft rather than looking to industrialize, looking to actually scale production up, that are, in a way, keeping either the industry localized and small scale? So how far is that the sort of, if you will, English problem? And given that, I think, yeah, everybody in this room, apart from me obviously, but everybody on this panel has started their own watch firm pretty much from scratch, found their own funding for it. The education establishment that 3 individuals on this panel is now defunct, doesn't exist anymore. 2 of the others have changed. How far is the English problem England and all those issues? And so I'll start with Roger on that.
I was hoping you wouldn't. Yes, I mean, I suppose governments, have a role to play in this, but,
You're in the Isle of Man, which is, I believe, tax-friendly.
well, yes. But, you could say, well, what was the industry doing? What was the British Horological Institute doing? What was the Worshipful Company of Clockmakers doing? They should have been lobbying the politicians and, trying to get assistance. So there's, we lost out big time. And today, yes, there is an issue with training. And the training that I had, British Horological Institute run course, for me was perfect. And it set me off on this fascinating sort of journey. But even now, there are issues with training, and I believe that the WASTEP course in Manchester is now scaling back on the number of hours that it puts to training a student. It's been cut from 3,000 hours to 1,500 hours because they're wanting to train people more for sequential servicing as opposed to looking at a bigger picture. So it's going to, that's going to obviously affect British watchmaking, a future resurgence in British watchmaking, but long term it'll affect the Swiss watch industry as well. So
presumably it'll affect the watches too, if the watchmakers of tomorrow are not trained at the same level as they have been in the past. I mean, that's just the training aspect. Now, presumably there's also the other aspects of how easy was it for you to start your own companies. You are actually in the Isle of Man. You've raised a lot of the capital, I believe, yourself. Stephen, you had to go to Switzerland. And then it was you and Robert in a former horse stable,
Yeah.
literally.
Yeah.
Cottage
we
industry.
started from zero as well, so had to find ways to generate the capital you needed to start. But we didn't start with the idea of creating a brand. So it's kind of a natural process, I think, also for probably all of us in a way. You start out not with the idea to make a commercial success. We started out with an idea of what we wanted to do, and we had a story we wanted to tell and a journey that we wanted to carve out. And so if you begin from there, it's quite a different approach than saying, okay, there's a market, there's an opportunity, let's do something to fill that. That's very different.
Right. Peter, you started your company in Switzerland as well. Was that because of the parts and the labor, or it just happened?
I had been living there for 4 years. I had got tired of working for other companies. After leaving Renault and Papi, I worked for a couple of others. And there was just this sense of, rather than complain about a situation that I wasn't happy with, that to create something of my own. And at that period, there wasn't enough watchmakers out there building complications. So I already had started to build my own watch, which was my own rites of passage for myself when I was in Le Locle, which I then finished when I became independent and moved down to Lake Geneva. And the reason that the brand then developed was completely unintentional. I had literally taken the pocket watch that I made, which was entirely for myself, and I took pictures of it to the Basel Watch Fair where I met Philippe Dufour. And Philippe saw it, and he said, and he was exhibiting with the AHCI, and he just said, you have to be here next year. This was in 2001. So to exhibit at AHCI at Basel, it was about 6,000 Swiss francs, which I think is pretty much what it is today. But you don't just go there to say, hey, this is what I made. Okay, that's kind of an expensive ego trip. So I developed wristwatches which followed the DNA of that pocket watch, whilst doing multiple other jobs. I was earning my money through other occupations within the industry. And I just took the DNA which was within that pocket watch, built it into the wristwatch that I wanted, and then showed it the following year, in 2002. And then in 2003, by the time we did that, by 2003, I think we made the first 10 to 15 pieces, and people liked the design. To show you how sort of obscure the story is, the name on the watch is originally, which was the name on the very first pocket watch, was the Watch Workshop. And I had put Speak Marin on one side of the dial just to have equilibrium, because there was the Watch Workshop on one side and there was a blank on the other side. And when the collectors started to order the watches, as one person said, we don't want Jack's shed, we want your name. So it
is the shed.
It was. There we go.
I picked that right.
It was back in that garden shed. So it was completely, from my side, it was happenstance. It was serendipity that what I liked, other people liked, and my family name ended up becoming a brand name. But it was not intentional. There was everything was kind of a growing process. It was a learning curve. It was extraordinary. And made loads of mistakes, which is great because that's feedback in the same way as when you do things right, it's feedback. And it was an incredible time, the whole process. But there was no business plan. There was no real planned strategy behind it. It was just an evolution.
Right. And Rebecca, you're literally starting out now. I mean,
Yes, yeah. We had the really great idea of trying to set up an independent watch workshop in the middle of a recession, which was exciting. So yeah, we were trying to start up when the banks weren't lending, when people were being really reluctant with investments, and as new startup independent watch brand is high risk, as I'm sure anyone here will know. So yeah, it was really, really challenging and a really tough few years, and I think there isn't a huge amount of support. I mean, you mentioned with Rolex moving because of tax issues. That's a long-term problem that we've had. part of my research looking at the emergence of non-standardized mass production in Europe was looking at how the clockmakers company were petitioning government in the 1790s because William Pitt imposed high taxes on watches to pay for the war with France. So this kind of constant high taxes, taxing things, how are we going to make more money? We'll just put higher taxes on everything. It makes it incredibly hard to compete. And there's no denying that any British-made product, it's not just watches. And then we've got problems in education as well. Arts and crafts design are generally really suffering at UK schools at the moment. And it's becoming more of an issue. It's becoming more recognised as well. So I'm involved with the Heritage Crafts Association. Their conference was at the Royal School of Medicine. And there was a conference the week beforehand where a series of top surgeons are coming forward saying that they're needing to send their medical students for sewing lessons because we're not picking up these haptic skills at school anymore. You know, we used to do wood shop and textiles and things like that. They're all being cut out of the curriculum. And it's quite a terrifying prospect, isn't it? The idea of if you ever have to have an operation, the person cutting you open might not be able to sew you back together again. So we're starting to realise, and it's triggered, to my knowledge, the first time we've got an all-party parliamentary group for crafts who are meeting for the first time in October. So we're going to start hopefully having a voice, but as the arguments the clockmakers company had in the 1790s demonstrate, it doesn't mean they'll actually listen to us, but you know, we can only give it a go. There's certainly not enough support, I think, for British industrial businesses, creatives generally. I don't think watchmakers are the only ones.
Which will, and one more question, then I'll turn the questioning open to the floor. Given that's where we stop in terms of the sort of particular questions, then for each of you, open question, do you actually think that English watchmaking exists because we rely on people knowing GMT? It's still on watches around the world. It's called Greenwich Mean Time. So is that why we still sort of are known as English watchmakers? And I'll start from Peter, and we'll work back down to Steve.
That's the most ridiculous question.
I just simply thought that I'd work off the actual title.
I think it's like a part of a Dan Brown novel. You know, it's just like it's like if you link it really well, then it kind of makes all sense, and suddenly you find the Grail at the end of it. It's a wonderful link to the history of English watchmaking, of horology. There's no association, to my way of thinking, there's no association to the world today. But it is, it harks back to history. It harks back to the birth of time. I'm not sure when it was,
1884.
1884. I mean,
in Washington.
part of it was a standardization of time. I mean, at one point, even in the middle 19th century, the time was different in different cities in England. Nothing to do with time zones. It was just that there was no accuracy. And then suddenly you have accuracy within a country, and then you have an accuracy around the world. I mean, it's a phenomenal thing. And that was all part of the history. That's part of the legacy of English horology. So I think it's wonderful. But I don't really...
Yeah, we're still trading off it, though. That's
Are we trading off it? Is there anybody here trading off of
I
it?
don't think any of us make world time watches, do we? So,
No.
The Brits don't do complications. Yeah.
You might,
We did it easy.
or maybe Stephen should ask that one next.
Can I just come back on the training,
Sure.
just as because it's not only in the UK, in Switzerland. You know, I mentioned in Switzerland there were 10 watchmaking schools in the sort of the golden era, and as far as I know, I think in the worst time it was down to 1 or 2. They've now reopened a couple, but it's still a big problem, training, and that's what pushed also Robert, myself, Philippe Dufour, Kari Voutilainen and Vianney Halter to create a foundation 10 years ago with this bold utopic idea that the watch industry would help us to safeguard and preserve and transmit these basic, fundamental, foundation, traditional skills of watchmaking. And we're still waiting. The phone is very dusty, and it's waiting for that call. But, you know, we don't give up. We've continued. We did projects. We've already completed an amazing adventure of a project, and we have other ones which we come on. And we try and do a bit. You know, even although we were ridiculed in Mexico, in CR, an exhibition in Mexico in October. We're going to go back again, and our sort of student watchmaking student from the project that we did, Naissance du Montre, gives a 3-day workshop to local watchmakers. Now, people have ridiculed that, saying, you know, what's the point? But we're trying to draw attention. Mexico has no watchmaking school, and yet it's a great market for watches. Great culture, great passion, you know, a lot of Latin passion there, and they love it. So, you know, it is a wider problem, and Rebecca mentioned quite rightly other areas. You know, in the years past, tool makers were trained in Switzerland probably 200 each year. Today there are maybe 20. So out of your pool of 200, you would have 5 exceptional, passionate, really skilled ones. Today, out of 20, you maybe have 1 every 2 or 3 years. So, you know, this is a real issue, and one that needs to be addressed. Sorry, I've tried to steer around the colonizing GMT to give a bit of time there, but well, the positioning of a standard time, it's exactly right. Nothing that we have here, the telephone, the smartphone, to the technology, to the electricity, would work without a standardization of time, because the electric current depends on a very equal frequency, which is time-based. So, you know, there is so much which came from the pioneer watchmakers, or clockmakers, or even blacksmiths originally, to have a notion of time, first the monks, and then civil time, and then domestic time, and you know, we've come a hell of a long way with all of that. And Greenwich at the time, yeah, it's actually quite a good point to have a point in Europe, because you've got the US one side. I know from our team that you know, you start your day talking to Asia at the end of their day, and then you finish your day talking to the west coast of the USA. So it's kind of logical to have a position. Greenwich is it's a very historic place. Harrison worked his whole life for that. So, you know, maybe it's sentimental and nostalgic. Maybe the new standard would be Beijing, or, you know.
Maybe
who knows?
not.
I think most people have it in their mind now. It's been 140 years.
Yeah.
That's where it was.
Yeah.
It all came about because the USA had already adopted British time to use for their own time standards.
Yep.
And going back to your painting, the globe red,
Yeah.
3/4 of all the sea charts, you used Greenwich as its
I wasn't going to rub that in. You know, we're very cosmopolitan.
No, we are very cosmopolitan.
Public here today. You didn't want to.
But it's just that, you know, the 25 member states all met up in 1884.
Yeah.
Apart from France and Brazil and San Domingo, they all agreed that Greenwich should be the one. I think the French still think that maybe it should still be in.
But the French have always been a few minutes late, so, you know, what can you do?
Actually, if you go and stand on the Greenwich Meridian now, you're in the wrong place because it's moved about 100 metres. So.
There's other wonderful stories of them having a laser that used to fire across. The problem was when they built on Docklands, it actually used to hit people in the offices and stuff with this sort of red light like this. Yeah. Anyway, questions from the audience. Do we have a microphone, or are we going to shout at each other? Susie? Okay. Yep, James.
Thank you all. That was really interesting. I think we can all agree that George Daniels was a major influence in the resurgence of British watchmaking. How much do you think that his colleague and friend Derek Pratt had to do with it?
I'm going to give that to Richard. Given Richard's, just to give a bit of detail, do you wish to give the detail?
No, you can give
I can give the detail. The Frodisham double impulse chronometer that Richard is actually wearing right now was the first wristwatch to actually implement this double impulse escapement that was both George Daniels' work and heavily input from Derek Pratt as well. So if you want to take it from there, Richard.
Indeed, George made 7 watches with the double impulse chronometer escapement, Space Traveller being the most famous one. Derek Pratt made a tourbillon version of it. And so one has to step back a little bit, James, I think, in answer to your question. They were both very good friends, and they were both extremely talented watchmakers. And they used to spend time together on the telephone every weekend discussing projects. What should we do? How can this be done? Give me an idea. Bounce an idea off me. And that's what they did. I think George probably said similar things to you as well.
Yeah, very good friends.
Yeah, I think, we shouldn't also forget, I mean, there were actually 3 very significant English watchmakers. And there was George Daniels, there was Derek Pratt, and Anthony Randall as well. And Anthony Randall is still with us, and an amazing guy, but such different characters, very, very interesting, and different methods of working. And, there are a few others who I think contributed, certainly for perhaps some of us, that inspirational moment. George's book of watchmaking was, very, very well thumbed copies of that. Derek's work, I think, was very, very instrumental. Anthony Randall invented and built the first multi-axe tourbillon in a carriage clock in the 70s. And there was, again, it shows we had this creative capacity, which is there, but sometimes a little bit of a problem to carry that through. But there's a new relay here, so that's very exciting. No pressure there at all. But very important, I think that the quartz, the electronic watch, came at a moment and kind of gave the mechanical watch a chance to save itself, because we talked about industrialization. In fact, it was Jones who created IWC using the water power in Schaffhausen in Switzerland, who had been to the US and seen the automated machines, mostly for making munitions originally, and seen this idea and said, well, we can make watches, and that was that beginning, and that set in train a whole train of events which went through a little over a century until the electronic watch crisis. And at the end of that, you had very, very cheap, poorly made mechanical watches where they'd been trying to reduce the cost, and so all the quality disappeared, really. And the electronic watch kind of did a sort of swept the whole slate clean and gave the watchmaking a chance to reinvent itself and go back to the fundamentals. And what do we find fascinating? Mohammed Siddiqui said this morning he sleeps with the sound of his watch. Now, if you think about it, an electronic quartz watch beats dead seconds, and that to have on your wrist or that sound at night it's close to our heart rate, and I think there's something kind of disturbing about that. Whereas a mechanical watch, which is beating at a faster rate, there's something sort of comforting. It's working hard. It's working 24/7, and there's something I think we find fascinating and kind of reassuring that, okay, we're working hard, but there's something working really hard as well to accompany us on that journey.
Susie, you had your hand up? No? Okay.
Thanks for a very interesting discussion all. It was raised just now that there was a time where you could look at a watch and definitively say, this comes from the Geneva School of Watchmaking, this has the Châteaulois strain, this is a German watch, this is made by an English watchmaker. And Andrew touched on it a bit earlier and, talked about things like finishing and the hands-on approach, but I don't think we actually came down to specifics. So I'd like to ask each of you in turn maybe, like in your mind, what constitutes the platonic ideal of an English watch, something that you look at it identifiably, in terms of design cues, in terms of construction, in terms of approach even?
Would you, anywhere you want to start? Okay, Peter.
Sorry, it's just that I think that whatever was in relation to a design element with a three-quarter plate or specifics with what English watchmaking was, it doesn't apply. The specifics in relation to the level of finishing of a product can be different from each individual. It's just the detail that actually goes into it, the finesse, the time, and you kind of feel that when you touch those kind of watches. So there is no one, from my point of view, there is not necessarily a DNA element which will traverse every individual English person's watch movement. It's more who they are and what they bring to it. And that is a reflection of an individual. It's the reflection of each brand's personality, which is then shown within the actual watch. So I don't think that you can actually see. It's almost a feeling. When I was involved in restoration, you feel the soul of the people or the soul of the companies. And when you work on a watch which has actually been finished by an individual, you feel that. That's why I do what I do today, because I want to share that. But I don't think there's really identifiable elements which can actually connect people together.
Well, we could, I think.
I disagree.
Go for
yeah.
it. Go for it.
I mean, personally, yes. I mean, I think looking at Stephen's watch and Richard's and Rebecca's and so on, and the Grubel forces. You look at the movement and it shouts Britishness to me. I know that a British watchmaker is working on that watch. We have the double wheel, the Frodsham watch here to my right. That is an English watch through and through, and it's that could never have been produced in Switzerland. You turn the back over and it's got the frosted finish. It's got the nickel silver plates, which is unusual for a British watch, but it's a British watch through and through, and the same with Rebecca's. My watches, I mean, it is a very difficult process to formalise my own style, but maybe somebody else could say this, but I feel that my watches are very strong, very British. They're sort of like they're built for purpose. And if you look back at the English pocket watches, there's a wonderful collection up at Bonham's at the moment where you'll see Tompion pocket watches and some of the greatest pocket watches, and they are very, very identifiable as being British. They are strong, they're robust. And when I was trying to formalise ideas as to the style or the route I should go down, obviously I was hugely influenced by these types of watches. And what I tried to create with my very first Series 1 wristwatch, which is a rectangular sort of piece, was what would the British watchmaking industry be doing today had that industry continued? What would at the very highest sort of level, what would we be making today? And so obviously, yes, there's huge influences in my work in terms of the frosted plates, the gilded plates, polished chatons, blue steel screws, three-quarter plates, barrel bridges, engraving on the barrel bridge, highly polished gold cocks, highly polished steel work. All the steel work throughout the whole watch is black polished. There's perhaps a couple of components that we don't black polish, but you can. There's a very nice Tompion that I had the privilege to be holding yesterday, and I know it was a quarter repeater, and if you were to remove that dial of the Tompion, you'd see black polishing just like on my watches.
If I wanted to play devil's advocate, you could equally say the same with German.
Oh yeah, well there were similarities.
Yeah. I think there may be certainly one element, perhaps Rebecca can add, but English finishing from the up until the sort of it finally pretty much died out. The process in Clerkenwell and that area where it was practiced was black polished but sharp edges. And actually, Roger, you practice that. You have sharp edges. You don't do beveling. Swiss finishing is more, and perhaps German finishing is more about beveling and this breaking the angle corners between the top surface and the flanks, and so that is a characteristic element which I still think exists, but others have these things by osmosis sort of cross frontiers over have crossed frontiers over the decades, haven't they? I think perhaps Rich can say for his nickel silver raw movement plates and bridges, but it's a good material to use because you can do some great finishing on that, which you can't do on brass. Brass today is not made like it used to be made. Bit of nostalgia there. It wouldn't be a British panel without a bit of nostalgia, would it? So,
Talking of which, but Frodsham slightly different from you guys in that it's a 185-year-old company,
Yeah.
synonymous with making high-end, high-grade, precision timekeeping instruments. So we have a little bit of DNA that we can draw upon. And the English, in answer to your question, the Englishness does, I think, or hope, shine through, that you can go, yes, as Peter was saying earlier, look at that lovely chronometer escapement. Well, that's quintessentially English. One would hope that that's the same when you look at the modern products compared with the vintage ones.
And Rebecca, finally, anything to...
In
wish to add?
design terms, I think, I don't know, see, I like anglage. We use anglage in our watches, putting the angles on things. But I suppose the watch we're making at the moment, our in-house movement, will be quite traditionally British in style, because we've kind of looked at this idea. We went to the the very first and one of the last fully machine-made British watches from the 1880s, and decided to use that as our reference point, I suppose, to kind of try and reverse engineer it, but with the benefit of nearly 150 years of technology. To give our own interpretation of a heritage timepiece. So we're very brave or very foolish. We're rebuilding the English lever escapement, which hasn't been made commercially in over 100 years, probably. So we'll let you know how that goes. These days with social media, you'll probably see how it goes. And I suppose that kind of, I think innovation is one of the things that unites even more than design in some ways. We might not make many of things, but we generally, I think, tend to make them very well. And that kind of trying to push boundaries, trying to find our own way of doing things, British style, I think that makes us unique, maybe.
I'm going to ask for one more question, because we're reaching the half-hour mark. Fiona?
No. Is that working? No, yeah.
I think it is.
I'll just shout. My question was actually to do with the support element, and it was something that crossed my mind even earlier on this morning in the very first discussion. So I just have a personal belief that in the next, 5 years, 10 years, anything that can be automated will be, and the only thing that you can't automate is true creativity. And that's where I think, in terms of the world and globalization and everything, that's where the real value is that. Now, if you think about creativity, you think about being innovative and doing something new, which means taking risks. So if you've started up your own company, we all know the banks hate that. And in other creative industries, in terms of design, there's loads of grants, prizes, support. In certain countries, even at government level, there is a lot of support. Fashion, the same. And I really feel like watchmaking to me I don't see it as the same as art, but I see it as equal in terms of importance and cultural value. So my question is, with the glaringly obvious lack of support, apart from within the industry itself, so like journalists who will write about an independent brand, really to support them so people know they exist, suppliers or other colleagues who will help you to make watches if you need, within itself you've got its own little ecosystem. What you've started up with a foundation I think is remarkable. What can we do to have a little bit more support? Because I don't see why it should be such a slog when it's such an amazing, rich industry with so much potential. And anybody who does sort of peek behind the curtain and discover watchmaking, they just fall in love with it literally instantly if they get that little gap. So that's a very long way of asking what do you think are the options? Because you must have chatted about it either with your pals or in the pub with other people. So maybe you have some suggestions about that.
Any volunteers?
He's already doing it.
Well,
He's trying to do it.
I think in an odd way, when if you don't struggle, the end result usually isn't going to be as good. And the harder it is, the better you find. If you get over that challenge, the result is going to be great. And so, yes, it is. Yeah, of course, it's a real struggle. I mean, even when Robert and I started, when we wanted to build our watch, we were doing R&D work between 1999 and 2004, the time it took to build our first watch, which we had to finance completely ourselves. The last people who would lend us any money were any of the banks or anybody in Switzerland, because who wanted to redo the watchmaking crisis thing, which is traditionally a cyclic industry which goes up and down. You know, demand increases, so they ramp up production, demand levels off, and then it crashes down, and then this has been a historical cycle for the last century or so. And yet, I think, you know, as technology comes along, this is an interesting thing that we tend to have a reaction to it, and so I think part of the interest, we come back to more fundamentals, because human beings, we're tactile. And it's this link between the creativity of the mind, the human mind, and the hand to create and innovate and make things. And this is where, for me, it's perhaps a controversial thing to say, and I'll have all the tech companies after me, artificial intelligence does not exist. It is rubbish. It's just a label put on robotization, because it's all based on gathering data. So what they're trying to do is they gather a sufficient amount of data that they cover every possible angle. So it's kind of scary, because, you know, we think of things which didn't exist. You know, they're not sitting in a book. Nobody taught us that in a textbook, an original thought, until they can get a computer which comes up with an original joke. Somebody told me this, actually. Is it? Yeah? Until the computer can come up with an original joke that's actually funny, I think the rest of it is just, it's marketing. You know, the technology that we use, that I swear by, the smartphone, you think about the cycle. The first ones were huge. They were like, it was a car battery with a brick, with a brick. And then it got down to the stage where you had the little communicator, which was not much bigger than that smart device which they've put a strap on. And yet it's turned full circle, and now it's almost it's bigger than the first computers. So there's something interesting there, and I think it's what we have to not lose sight of, that we are tactile beings, and we like things. We like the idea of an artisan struggling to make something, from the point of view of the collector, and the collector, fortunately, has the ability and is captured by that magic to support us. And the media like to help talk about what we do, because it gives them great content. It's a really unique story. All of us in different ways struggle in that path. So, yeah, no, it certainly must be that we have to try and continuously wake up the people with resource and with the means to enable us to go further. But there has to be a bit of struggle in there, otherwise the adventure. I don't know. What do you think?
I was going to say that the cliche is not so much having the resources, but having resourcefulness to be able to find the solutions for the problems. And that is part of what makes whether doesn't matter what you are as an independent, somebody who's self-employed, you have to find those solutions. It's part of the process, I would say. If you make it easy, then you won't get the same kind of results.
It's not the machines, it's the people behind, or the tools. It's what's behind that makes the difference.
Yeah, but at the same time, I'm sorry, but there's the gap between, if you're doing art or design or fashion, it's not about a handout or being easy. There are so many different options where it's still bloody hard to make the thing, to then show in the first place, to then get the grant. So the struggle is there, but there's just more support. And what I always wonder is, it's an industry that really loves creativity. It's part of the charm and on the commercial side, how people sell the product. But yet I don't see the support for the creativity bit as much as in other industries that I would say are of equal cultural value.
Yeah.
I think there should be.
I agree. I'm all for struggle. It does make you more innovative. It does change your approach, and you work harder. It produces a better craftsperson at the end of it. But at the same time, I don't really see the reason for the level of struggle. I think there's some struggle that it's not necessary to get where you need to be. And I think watchmaking does seem to be, in my experience of trying to go for grants and things, it's seen as such a luxury industry that if you're just here, you don't need the money, so why are you here asking? So you get denied opportunities before you even get a chance of getting your foot in the door. So yeah, struggle is important, but it should be there for a reason. It shouldn't be just because people make up their mind about what you're doing, the way you look, and that means that, you know, you're less in need. Because I mean, watchmaking was, the Heritage Crafts Association did some research on the state of craft in Britain and listed watchmaking as an endangered craft. It's at risk. So the future of this skill is at risk in this country. And one of the problems you have as well, talking about kind of options and getting on the right path, we teach technician grade watchmakers. So in Manchester, we have, again, like Roger mentioned, sequential servicing. They're very good at that. And there are plenty of jobs out there in service centres for them to do that kind of work. But then the opportunity to go from being a technician to a master, where are you going to train? Where are you going to get those skills? Because companies like ours are very few and far between. Just the options aren't there. So we're going to have a huge number of technician watchmakers, but true British master watchmakers, unless we find ways to kind of connect people and finance those apprenticeships. Because for a one-man band, I'm sure, Roger, when you started out, and for all of you, that first person you hire, you've just doubled your workforce. And if they need training, you're going to be spending all your time teaching them, and you're not going to do any of your own work. And it is a huge burden for you to take that first person on. So kind of some more support, I think, around those sort of schemes, and not thinking, yeah, we'll fund you to go to university, but then you're on your own. There needs to be that continued support, I think, would help, certainly.
Okay, at that point, I'd truly like to thank our panelists today for being here for such an interesting discussion. And I know better to stand in the way of watch enthusiasts and a glass of wine or other libations. So thank you very much for the attendance.